Hello, my name is Rickard, and in this tutorial, I'm going to show you some tricks to doing shadows in Photoshop.
Hi, I'm Jason. First of all, huge shout out to the amazing Nucly community. I know, Rickard, that you read just about all of their comments. This week we got a bunch of requests about how to make realistic shadows. It's kind of perfect for me. I was actually looking for shadows in mockups today, and I found some mockups that were horrible. So let me just share this with you and just get your opinion. Like, what went wrong on this mockup here with these two coffee cups?
Well, someone's obviously not observing real-world shadows. That's probably the thing that you're going to do that's going to make the biggest difference in terms of shadows is really observing real-world shadows and trying to emulate them as closely as possible. In this one here, there isn't really a cast shadow, but the ambient shadow is obviously not strong enough, so it just doesn't look realistic.
What about this guy here?
So this one does have a very strong cast shadow. It's too strong. If you look at the shadows inside the towel itself, that gives you a very good indication of what the strength of the shadow should be. Obviously this one's way too strong. Also, where it's landing on the feet doesn't quite make sense. And it's not the same focus as the rest of the image. So those are all issues. This one obviously does not have a strong enough ambient shadow, so it looks like it's floating rather than resting on the ground.
Okay, so you said ambient shadow, and I've never necessarily had to think about different types of shadows. Can you kind of maybe show us something like, how do you break those down? How does that work?
Yeah, actually let me do a little example for you here. What I'll do is just create a new document. I'm just going to go to print, just grab, make an 8.5 by 11 document. I'm going to go on my linear gradient, just kind of create a gradient background here. And then we're going to make a ball. I'm going to take my marquee, just make a circle shape and fill that with white. So that's going to be our ball, and just to make it look a little more realistic, I'm going to go and add a gradient overlay to it. And for my gradient overlay, I want it to be multiply white to black, and I want it on radial. And that allows me, it basically creates this highlight on the ball itself. Which I can move around. So now we've got this ball and we can control where the light is. And we're going to cast a shadow here.
Just for you guys out there, you don't have to know how to do this. If you want to, you can, but Rickard's just showing you something, but you don't have to know how to do all these steps here.
Yeah. Okay, so your instinct may be go to drop shadow. That creates a very simple duplicate of your item that's then blurred, right? So if I take the blur down, which is the size, you can see I basically just have a black duplicate of my layer. And at its core, that's what a shadow is. It is a copy of your layer that's set to either black or to some kind of mode that makes the background darker, and then you either blur it or don't blur it. So that's kind of the basic, and then from there, where you blur it or how you distort it is all how you make that shadow more realistic. So let's cancel the drop shadow here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a copy of this ball layer in black. So to do that, I'm going to hold down Command and click on the layer thumbnail. That's going to select the transparency of the layer. Then I'm going to make a new layer, and we can call this layer shadow, and we're just going to fill this with black. So I'm going to make black my foreground color, and then Option Delete to fill, and then I'm going to drop my selection with Command D, deselect, and then I'm going to move this ball underneath. So now we have our shadow. So if our light is coming from this way, and if we have a flat surface, this ball is obviously going to be distorted by perspective. So let's do that first. We're just going to distort the perspective of it so it looks like it's laying on the surface of the ground. Now where it goes, Let's change the opacity of it to 80%. So where the shadow goes obviously is going to depend on where the light is. You can kind of tell from here that our light is probably somewhere around here, which means our shadow would kind of fall a little bit behind the object and to the right of it, like this. So this is a hard shadow. Depending on your light source is going to affect the softness of your shadow. So the sun is a good example. That light source is very far away and very strong, so you're going to get very sharp cast shadow. As the light gets closer to your object, so this lamp above me, or even a window, light coming in from a window, as that light gets closer to your object, your shadow is going to become softer. So in our case, our shadow is going to become blurred. So if we go to Gaussian blur, now you can see this would be a lamp next to it, right? And as that gets closer, that shadow is going to get more blurry. Now, one other thing to consider with ambient light, and if you've worked with 3D programs, they call it ambient occlusion, which is basically a fancy name for kind of the shadows where objects meet. So where an object meets, it's always going to get darker because there's less light that can travel into that corner. So even if we have a really soft shadow like this, it looks like the ball is floating because there's no hard shadow where it's meeting. So we could make a second copy of this, make it smaller, and put that just where the ball is touching the ground. And I would probably spread this out a little bit this way too, so it looks a little more realistic. And I could do that just with like a motion blur. And for the motion blur, I'm doing it at a 0 angle, and I'm just spreading it left to right. So it has less vertical blur than it does horizontal blur. So something like this. And then for this, I might even make one smaller that's just where the ball is touching. So something like this. And now it looks more like that ball's on the ground, even though it does have a soft shadow, because that point where the two objects meet, there's no light traveling there, and so you get that darkest spot. So that there is a soft shadow. Now if I were to do a hard shadow, it's basically doing the same thing but without the blur, and I would still leave the touch point shadow there. So here, make a shadow again, just fill that with black, deselect with Command D, transform that, and then have my hard shadow here, something like this. Take that down a little. And then for this, I could turn off the soft shadow. So something like that. So that's kind of the basics of shadows. Now, as we do it with more involved objects that aren't just the circle, it does get a little more complicated. But if you understand the basics of you're creating a copy of your object, making it black, and then distorting it onto the surface where the shadow is being cast, and then adding blur based on the light source, those are kind of your basic steps of creating a shadow.
Okay, so that's super cool, Rickard. How do you put that into actual use in a Photoshop file?
Okay, so let's go to File, Open, and you can get all these assets in the description of this video if you want to follow along. But let's tackle a soft shadow scenario to begin with. And for that, I'm going to take this image here. One thing to consider with soft shadows is the sun is a light source that is extremely bright and extremely far away. So the shadows it casts are going to be very strong and very sharp. Now, if you have a cloud cover, you've taken that light source and brought it from millions of miles away to only a few miles away. So all of a sudden, all your shadows are going to be very nice and soft, which is why photographers love doing portrait photography on cloudy days. In this scenario here, we have a cloudy day. So all of our shadows are soft. If you look at the trees, you can see that there are no hard shadows that they're casting. So in this scenario, what I want to do is I want to add something and then add a soft shadow to the ground. So let's go to File, Open. I have this file here. I got it off of Unsplash. It's kind of a cool object. So I'm going to make this smaller with just a free transform. We're going to have this kind of floating above our ground. So somewhere right about there.
Is this like some future Aliens horror movie, the new Predator movie coming out?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so first thing we need to do, this is not really related to shadows, but it's such a common error I see with compositing that I will bring it up here. Depending on where you want your object to be, you have to adjust your black point accordingly. And your black point is the color of your black. Black is never pure black. The closer an object is to the camera, the more black it's going to be. The further away it is, the less black it's going to be. So, if we look at this here, this object is probably black. These shadows are black, and they appear black, but they aren't a real black. If I select that color as a point type, or as a point sample, you'll notice it's a little bit above black. And the further away from camera, so if I zoom up here, you'll notice that the blackest point is pretty light compared to true black. So that's something you always need to keep in mind. For this image, I'm going to zoom in here and I'm just going to select this as my black point, because that's about where I want this object to be. Right now it feels like it's right next to us. I want to push it away. So with that color, I'm just going to add a solid color. There's many ways you can do this. And I'm going to put this on screen. I could also just add a curve on it, make it a little bit lighter, what have you. But this is an easy way using that color. All of a sudden that already looks like it's further pushed into the scene. I can also add a little more, pushing it into the scene by maybe adding a cloud in front of it, which I could do with, one of my cloud brushes.
I like that too, because it gives it scale. That's pretty cool, because all of a sudden now you're like, oh my God, it's huge.
Yeah, now it feels like it's something really large in the sky. Okay, so for this, the basic technique is the same. I'm going to hold down Command, click on the object so I have the transparency of it, make a new layer, fill that layer with black, so Option Delete. You will notice that there was a little line there. So the problem here is this cutout isn't a perfect cutout. So I'm going to show you a trick to get around that. I'm going to select this and make a mask, and now I can see the issue. So now with my mask selected, I can just do Command M and push my black to black. Okay, let's try this again and fill this with black. There you go. Okay, so I now have my shadow layer, and I'm going to transform this.
So real fast on transform, you hit Command T or Control T for a PC, and then you just push down on the top. No, you
start dragging these little handlers around. If you hold down Shift, you can not keep your proportions. It used to be the opposite. That's kind of a confusing change that Photoshop did. But if you don't hold Shift, it keeps your proportions. If you hold Shift, you can distort the proportions. Also, if you hold down Command, you can independently move these anchor points. And all I'm doing here is kind of distorting it to what I imagine the shadow of this would look like on the ground, so something like that. And then we can take this and blur it. And now if we look at the rest of this image, we can kind of see that the shadows have a blue tone. So I might want to do that, just to add a little bit of blue to this black.
So you just went to curves on that directly and pulled up the blue a little bit.
Yeah, pulled up the bottom of the blue, and that's just going to make my black a little bit bluer. So something like that, and then put it on multiply, and then maybe stretch it out even more a little bit. Now there are highlights on the edges of this. So one little trick that you can do is double click here and go to your blending options, and underlying, just drag this until you see some of those little highlights start to appear past your shadow like this. And you just want a little bit, just a hint of them, and then hold down option and split this. And that's just going to make it a little bit more realistic and blend in with your environment down here a little bit better.
That's so cool, and it's such a good trick. I feel like the shadow would be a little closer and to the right from camera, maybe too, or is that just me? Just based on where the other shadows are falling?
Yeah, maybe probably somewhere there, like there. And of course, it also depends on where you want the object to be, right? Like, because of the size of this object, I'd probably have it directly underneath, because it's the sky cover that's lighting it. So the sky being a dome around it, the shadow would always be directly underneath it. Obviously, if it's a sunny day and the sun's out, the sun would point, wherever the sun is, the opposite of the sun is where the shadow would be. But when you have a cloudy sky that's creating a dome around your object, the shadow is going to be directly below it. So that's just a little example there of how I would do a soft shadow.
Okay, so this is off topic, but could you throw in something cool from your one of your brush kits, birds or a person or something else for scale?
Oh yeah, let's add some birds around here just to give this some scale. I'm gonna go to my bird brushes. I'll include this one in the assets, but you can get the full kit on Nucly. We actually just released this recently. Something like that. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. Yeah, so there you go. That's how I would add a soft shadow. Next thing I want to show you is how to add a hard shadow. And for that, I'm going to open up this and then open up this character here. Okay, so he has a soft shadow right now. I'm going to put him into this scene and then show you how to do a hard shadow. So let's go ahead and select him. There we go.
And just for our viewers here, what did you do again just now?
So I went on to any of my selection tools here. That's going to give me the option of select subject. Click on that, go into select and mask. If you didn't have it selected before going into select and mask, you have the option here as well. Now I have my mask overlay set to 100%. You probably won't have that. It'll be like at 50. But you can also change your view type here depending on whatever you feel most comfortable with. I think the default is overlay. But this is made an OK cutout for our purposes. So let's go ahead and cut this out. I'm going to add a mask here and then convert this to a smart object. Pull this in here. Okay, so we want to add a shadow onto the ground, make it look like he's walking on the street. So first, let's add our ambient shadow before we even start with the cast shadow. I'm going to show you one other trick to do on that, and that's just go onto your gradient tool, go on the radial gradient, and make sure you're on foreground to transparent with black as your color. We can call this ambient shadow, and this will just be the contact shadow where his feet are touching the ground. So I'm going to go like that. Now I have this kind of glow ball, and then I can just squish it like this. Put one there, put one there, and then we'll put these underneath like that. Okay, so now we have the contact shadow. The next thing we're gonna do, we can take the opacity down on these two.
And usually you put the shadows on multiply if there's going to be any color in them, right? Because that transfers the color better.
Yeah, but if they're black and you're just using opacity to adjust how strong they are, then whether it's on normal or multiply will make no difference. Another thing you can do on the contact shadow is because you want the point of contact to be black. So what you can do is go on a soft brush and just underneath that layer, paint in the contact point. So something like this, something like that, and then.
This is where those coffee cup people we looked at kind of messed up, right? They didn't do this at all.
Correct. So you didn't have the contact point, which you always need. Even if you have soft shadows, you need that black contact point. So that's the contact. Now we're gonna do the hard shadow. For this, I'm gonna do the same thing. Copy my transparency, make a new layer, fill it with black, and then call this shadow. And then I'm going to do Command T, and in this case I want to distort it way more than just making it small. So I'm going to hold down Command, take this point here, and then I can start dragging this. So depending on where I want the shadow is where I would put this point. Okay, so let's say I want it, the light on him is hitting him on the right side. The light in the background, there's some light here, some shadow.
There's some, if you look behind his right hand, there's some tree light directly from the right.
Ah, yeah, there it is. Okay, so we're gonna have the shadows coming this way. And I don't want it as horizontal there. That would be kind of over here somewhere. I'm gonna cheat it and kind of make it go like this. So something like this. I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger at the bottom, and then I'm gonna try to make the feet touch each other like this. So something like that. I'm going to take down the opacity. And where they meet is kind of an important part. And normally just distorting it isn't going to get you 100% there. It'll get you about 90%. So like on this, I'm going to want to do another transform, maybe turn on this so I have a little more control here, and kind of just shove these around. I want to get this to look as realistic as possible in terms of the casting of that shadow. So I don't want anything overstepping, something like that. Now generally this is going to be probably closer to like where the legs are coming from, with maybe a little bit of a shoe portion here. So something like this.
So you can just draw in. Do you draw in very often when you're doing these and just kind of draw what it might look like?
Like this, where I want it to meet in a different spot, yes, I'll just go in and paint it. That's why I like to keep it all black, and then adjust just opacity and stuff like that after the fact. So that looks pretty good to me. Now there's a few things I want to show you that aren't so related to this image, but they're tricks that you can do. So for this image, let's say I wanted the shadow to be stronger where he is and then get weaker. Now, that's not going to happen with sunlight, but it will happen with street lights and many other shadows where they do have a light that's closer to the object. The shadow will be strongest next to the person and then get weaker. So for that, you can add a mask and then add just a linear gradient going from the shadow to the object. So there you can see the shadows kind of fading. Now the other thing is you may have a shadow that starts sharp and then as it gets away from your subject, it becomes softer. And to do that, what I'm going to do is first convert this to a smart object, then go to Filter, Blur Gallery, and here we can do a tilt shift. And basically what we're going to do is have the tilt shift source, which is right here. There, it's not going to be blurred at all. And I'm going to change this so it matches the angle of my shadow. pull this in so only the very front of that shadow is crisp, and then as it goes farther away, you can see it's getting softer. So something like this, and you can control when that happens. And that kind of gives you more realistic for indoor shadows, where as it falls away from your object, it becomes more blurry. So not for sunlight, but for where you want that effect of the shadow getting blurry, use Blur Gallery. You can also adjust it so it's not as strong. Maybe it's just like that. So those are some tricks for doing hard cast shadows. The one other thing, actually two other things. One other thing I want to show you is when you do have a shadow and you want to transfer that shadow to a different background. So I'm going to go ahead and open this file here. So we have this guy, he's against the wall. There's already some nice shadows happening on that wall, and I don't want to lose them. So first, let's go ahead and cut him out. I'm going to use the Object Select tool for that. We're just going to do copy this and then add a mask to it. It's done a really good job. And then what I'm going to do is just copy this entire thing, including all the parts that have shadows. So we'll do Command A. I'm going to turn off all my other layers and then go on a white gradient. Basically, I want to convert this into a black and white image with my shadow pretty strong on it. So let's go ahead and do Shift Option Command B. That'll just convert everything to black and white.
So you're using the black and white filter on there to get rid of colors when you
get rid
convert
of
it to
all
black.
color information because I'm just going to use this layer as my shadow. So next I'll go onto a curve with Command M, just kind of try to bring my white up so I just am seeing my shadow here. Make my blacks a little darker too.
So everything you're doing right now is basically like isolating the shadow?
Yes. So I don't care about anything else except for the shadow. I don't even care about him. I just care about the shadow.
So now you're taking a gradient tool and just gradiating a bunch of areas.
Yeah, gradienting away the stuff I don't want in this image. And the reason I use a gradient for this is because then if I accidentally miss something, there'll never be a hard line. It'll always softly gradate. Okay, so we'll call this our shadow. Now, I could just leave it like this and put it on multiply, or if you want your shadow layer to be black, what you can do is go to your channels, hold down Command, click on the RGB channel, and then invert that. So invert your selection, make a new layer, and then fill that with black. So that'll give you the same thing, but it's on a black layer that you can move around. So now I can take these two, open a different background, and then with both layers selected, I can put him in here. And now wherever I put him, he has that shadow from the other scene. It's actually come with it.
Okay, that's mind-blowing.
Well, because we're using the original shadow from the photo, it's always going to look very realistic. When you're using a photo and you're compositing into another scene, if you can take the shadows with you, do, because they will look much more realistic than any shadows you try to recreate in Photoshop. Okay, the last trick I want to show you, and this one is one that I recently learned, so it's a bit of a more advanced trick, but I think it's pretty cool and I think you'll like it. So this is for creating shadows for top viewed kind of objects, and you'll often see this in composites that have like lettering, or in this case I'm going to show you a book. So we're going to take this book and let's just replace our background. All right, I'm going to go to my libraries, and here I'm just going to use one of my Nucly wood textures to throw into this background. So we'll take this.
And they can get this stuff if they just go in the link and grab it, right?
I will include this texture. If you want the whole set, you can buy it on Nucly.
Hey, that kind of looks like my office.
Kind of is. Okay, so here we have a book, and if I do my normal drop shadow where I'm just copying the transparency, making it black, and then moving it, we have this effect that doesn't look very real. So I am going to show you one other trick, and that's using a blur technique. So here I'm going to do the same thing. Copy the transparency, fill that with black, deselect, call this shadow. I'm going to go to Filter, Blur Gallery, and I'm going to do a Path Blur. And I want my shadow to go this way. And from Basic Blur, I'm going to change this to a Rear Sync Blur. What that's going to do is it's going to make it only come out of one side. So now if I increase my shadow here,
Oh, that's legit. That's so cool.
you get this very cool effect where it looks like the light is shining and kind of creating this cast shadow along the side. So this is, it really only works for kind of a top-down view, but for a top-down view, it works much better than the other drop shadow techniques. And for like lettering and stuff like that, it's very nice if you're doing that kind of top-down. So that's a little secret trick for doing drop shadows. Although the method you'll use the most often is make a copy of your layer, transparency, turn it black, distort it, and then add some blur to it.
Okay, that looks amazing though. So where did I find that again?
So that is under Filter, Blur Gallery, Path Blur, and the trick there is to use the rear sync when you're selecting the type of blur. So I'm going to make a drop shadow copy, go to Filter, Blur Gallery, Path Blur, and then here change Basic Blur to Rear Sync Blur. And that'll make sure the blur only shows up on one side. And there you have it. That's how you create shadows in Photoshop.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Everybody, don't forget to subscribe and then grab your assets in the link below, and we will see you next time.
Awesome.